Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets here for you. So the Nigerian main index really is going to be the worst performer if it keeps up this trend among the large African markets that we track on the program, down 15.5% at today's close. Ghana, despite the 16% fall in the currency, we're going to cover that a little later in the hour, is 9% in the red so far in 2019. And yet another day on another profit warning, this time from the NAC itself over in East Africa. Here's what's coming up tonight. Boris Johnson secures a majority win and promises the UK will leave the EU at the end of January. The House Judiciary Committee approves 2 articles of impeachment against the US President Donald Trump. And we'll show you how this Ethiopian firm is converting weeds into renewable energy. But tonight we start in global business in the United Kingdom, where Boris Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit after the Conservatives secured a historic win in snap elections that he called. The Prime Minister, who now has met the Queen to ask to form a new government, has a majority of 80 in the House of Commons. That's the party's largest single majority there since 1987.
I say thank you for the trust you have placed in us and in me, and we will work round the clock to repay your trust and to deliver on your priorities with a parliament that works for you. And then I want to speak also to those who did not vote for us or for me and who wanted and perhaps still want to remain in the EU. And I want you to know that we in this one nation Conservative government will never ignore your good and positive feelings of warmth and sympathy towards the other nations of Europe.
Quite a bit has happened in the last 24 hours. Let's explore the details with Nicole Johnston. She's live in London for us tonight. So one large trend we're seeing in these election results is that places had voted Leave, but were essentially Labour seats, swung mostly in favour of Conservatives. What is it about the Conservative message that resonated with voters?
Well, first of all, the fact that it was a very simple message. It was clear, it was uncomplicated. In the end, it was 3 words: get Brexit done. And as you said, that is the message that resonated in the Labour heartland, in the Midlands, in Northern England, even in Wales. And I travelled to that region in the north, and time again you heard people say that while they were a Labour supporter, at the end of the day, that this time around they felt as though they would give their support and their vote to the Conservatives. Many of them said how hard it would be for them. It would be difficult. They hoped they wouldn't have to do it long term, but they'd had enough and they wanted to see Brexit done. They'd had enough of political wrangling, the infighting in Westminster, the back and forth with Brussels. And so this time around, an absolute trouncing for the Labour Party. It could take them a decade to try and bounce back from this. And now we've seen the result that we have, which is the Conservatives remaining in power.
Indeed. Before I get to my next question, I want to play part of the reaction from the architect of Labour's policy of more state intervention and nationalisation, John McDonnell.
I think all of us are pretty heartbroken for the people, not just party members and supporters, but for all the people who are dependent on the transformation we needed, all those people that are queuing up at food banks, all those children who are homeless and living in temporary accommodation, all those people on low wages and suffering from universal credit.
So, John McDonnell there, but after all the complaints we've heard about years of Tory austerity, why do the voters reject the Labour Party's ideas?
It seems that they just didn't believe the message this time around. As I said, they wanted to see Brexit done. But as you said, it's been a very difficult time for the last decade in many parts of the UK. That severe austerity that was introduced after the 2008 financial crisis, massive cutbacks to government services. You know, you travel to some of these northern cities and you can see just how devastated they've been. High unemployment, homelessness, people relying on food banks, a record number of them in the UK. And despite all of that, and despite the fact that many of these northern regions depend on the EU and the crisscross travel from the UK to the EU for manufacturing parts, despite all of that, this time around they've given their vote to the Conservatives. It seems that Labour just couldn't cut through the noise of Brexit. People didn't believe or trust the manifesto. There was a great deal of animosity towards Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. People told me that they didn't like him. He had sort of relatively low ratings on the opinion polls, and all of these factors have led to this result with the Conservatives in power and Labour really in the wilderness for now.
Indeed. One other place that you did travel to as well was Scotland. You covered the election campaigns over there quite significantly. The SNP gained quite a bit of ground over there. So they're keen, essentially, on pushing for another referendum. How will the Prime Minister deal with that?
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see how he deals with it. Up until this point, he has said that he won't allow Scotland to have a referendum on independence. He's been very firm on that. But, I mean, Scotland is the other huge story out of this election. The Scottish National Party, 48 seats out of 59. They've done extraordinarily well. And the First Minister and leader of the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, will be using that, saying that that is her mandate, her majority, to go forward with a referendum on independence. And just to remind our viewers, people in Scotland, they voted against Brexit. They want to stay inside the European Union. In the past, the first referendum they had for independence, they voted to stay inside the UK, but everything has changed. It's all been upended, so it's going to be a very interesting time for the UK, and the union here right now is looking very shaky indeed. This will be one of the big issues for Boris Johnson to face in the new year.
Indeed. So he has a stronger majority in the House. On paper, that strengthens his hand. But does it give him the leverage he needs to get a Brexit deal done quickly by the end of January for the Prime Minister?
It certainly does. He should be able to introduce that legislation to Parliament next week, and he should be able to get it all through by the end of January, which was the deadline. But it doesn't end there, and that's something to remember. We keep hearing get Brexit done, but that's not the end of it. In many ways, it's just the beginning, because the UK still has to negotiate trade deals with the European Union, not to mention the rest of the world. But in terms of the EU, they need those deals in place by the end of next year to avoid crashing out or a hard Brexit, so to speak. Analysts say that that will be impossible to achieve, that it's not enough time, that it could take 6 or 7 years, in which case there is the option for the UK to ask for an extension. They would need to ask for that by summer, by the middle of next year. Now, we've heard from Boris Johnson time and again that he doesn't want any more extensions. He has been forced to ask for one in the past. So it's a long process to go. We'll wait and see how these trade talks go next year, but it's definitely not the end of Brexit at this stage.
Indeed, certainly one of the big meta trends to look out for next year. One last question for you, Nicole. Walk us through the reactions in the markets today. How did the currency, the sterling and equity markets respond?
Well, the first sign of a boost on the markets we saw late Thursday night when those exit polls started to come out. The sterling increased by 2.5%, a massive increase. Since then, it's cooled a little bit, but it's still holding firm. A real sign that the markets are relieved that there could finally be some political certainty here in the UK, some economic certainty and some real movement on Brexit, with something, actually happening at the beginning of next year. The markets have also been firm in terms of the stock markets, and we have seen some increases in stocks that would have been potentially affected by part nationalisation under a Labour government. So a real boost and a sign of confidence in the UK markets and the FTSE here.
Indeed. Nicole Johnston in London. Thank you very much. Now, while Boris Johnson has secured his electoral victory in the United Kingdom, leaders in the EU were attending a meeting in Brussels without the UK Prime Minister. The leaders there say they now want a quick divorce deal. They also want to move on to trade talks between the UK and the EU, which Nicole is just talking about, even if that proves to be a very difficult thing to get done. The EU says it's ready to negotiate a free trade agreement, but many in the EU fear that the UK might try to reinvent itself as a low regulation, low touch, light touch rival, if you will. EU officials do warn that Johnson's plan to diverge away from EU rules could make negotiations even more complicated. EU trade pacts with countries like South Korea, Japan and Canada, they all took anywhere between 5 to 9 years to complete. So wrapping up talks between the UK and the EU in barely 12 months, that's a very tall order. In the meantime, EU leaders have been congratulating Mr. Johnson on his election triumph.
It's obviously a giant success for Boris Johnson. He's a charismatic leader. He won, and now they will leave, unfortunately. That is bad news for Europe.
I'm keen to work very hard with Prime Minister Johnson on getting the Executive and Assembly up and running again in Northern Ireland. I think that's absolutely crucial now and has to be a key priority for the next couple of weeks. And then we go on to the next phase of Brexit, which is negotiating a mighty new future economic partnership between the EU and the UK, and I think that can be done.
I have to tell you that I really appreciate him as a person. I do not always share the same political views, but that's the principle of being in different parties. But we had a good discussion in Luxembourg, but we were not able to present them to the press. But I appreciate the person, and we had good discussions, and I'm convinced that we'll be able also to be still partners for the future.
Citizens in London have been reacting to the Conservative Party's crushing victory last night. They had plenty to say on where that leaves the country as far as Brexit is concerned.
I don't think anyone thought it would be this big. I guess the one silver lining is that it establishes real clarity. There is a clear result. The way forward is much more defined now and easy to see. It might not be the one all of us would like to go on, frankly, but it does remove some uncertainty, I hope.
So I think the country will be significantly worse off out of Europe, and I think it will be significantly worse off with the Tory government, who clearly don't care about the NHS, about social care, all the things that people who are the most vulnerable are really going to suffer for. I don't think they care. I think they say what they need it to say to get into power, and it's a disaster.
Jeremy Corbyn comes across as quite a negative person, and you don't want a negative leader. You want to be represented by someone who's very positive, quite enthusiastic about everything, and no matter what, just like going for a positive result. Labour, Jeremy Corbyn is stepping down as well. I think it's a fair point. He should have stepped down a couple of years ago.
To me, it's been a campaign based on lies and untruths and just statements that could never be fulfilled by either party, and now to see an overwhelming majority given to someone who I don't think is trustworthy, it's kind of disappointing.
A quick run through some company news. Starting here in Kenya, the competition authority here has approved the planned merger between Airtel Kenya and Telkom Kenya, the number 2 and number 3 mobile service providers, respectively. According to the authority, the merged entity cannot in any way be allowed to enter into any sales agreement in the next 5 years, and it must honour any existing contracts with government bodies. The deal could challenge market leader Safaricom's dominance of the East African country's telecommunications industry. South Africa's MTN, in the meantime, will be defending its views on lower data prices before a competition tribunal. In its inquiry into data prices, the country's competition commission found that the two largest operators, that's Vodacom and MTN, were essentially practicing unfair price discrimination with their data bundles. It also added that the two operators could face prosecution if they do not cut data prices within 8 weeks. In Nigeria, the federal government has suspended Turkish Airlines flights into the country. That decision is due to repeated cases of poor passenger treatment, as well as using the wrong size of aircraft. The Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority says that suspension will last until the airline is ready to operate with the right size of aircraft that can transport all passengers with the baggage at the exact same time. And Barclays Bank says agriculture will continue to be an important focus area as it changes its name to ABSA in February next year. The bank's partnerships with USAID's financing Ghanaian agriculture project currently helps to grow the country's staple food supply while creating economic fortunes for many a citizen in Ghana. That's a run through your headlines. It's time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up. We'll look at the outcomes from the South African president meeting with his ministers of energy and public enterprises. And forests are under threat from illegal charcoal traders in Zimbabwe. How do you deal with it? We'll explore that next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sumitra Nyang. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now, South Africa's government has asked industry players for the cheapest and the fastest options to ease a brutal power crunch in the country. President Cyril Ramaphosa has held a meeting with his cabinet today to try and resolve a crisis that is threatening the growth of the country's economy. Eskom cut power for the 9th day in a row, and it's choking under a massive debt burden that's now essentially close to $31 billion. It's also struggling to meet demand because its creaking fleet of aging, poorly maintained coal-fired power plants are simply not being maintained properly. Let's get to the latest details on what exactly is going on in Africa's most industrialized economy. CGTN's Sumitra Nyang joins us now live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Sumitra, what's the outlook for power supply over the weekend?
Well, Rama, we're still at a stage 2 load shedding, but there is a suggestion coming from Eskom that we could be moved down to stage 1 load shedding over the weekend. And of course, we heard the president saying that load shedding would be stopped from Tuesday next week until the end of January. Of course, we still need to get through this weekend. It's a real inconvenience for ordinary South Africans, but it's a bigger problem for small businesses. It is the festive season. Christmas shopping is in full swing, but retailers are struggling to keep open. Some of the bigger businesses have put in alternatives like generators to keep operational. But for the smaller businesses, it's a huge cost to incur. Many are closing each time the lights go off. There's only 2 weekends left to get all of that last minute shopping done. And retailers especially were banking on this time, considering that we've had such a tough time this year. So we're not too sure what the weekend holds for us, but it does look like the load shedding has been reduced. There's load shedding currently happening now in the area that I'm in. Ramah?
Indeed. Do we have any idea what concrete outcomes have come out of the meeting between the President and his cabinet today?
Well, you know, we've been waiting for more information all day, but not much detail has come through, I'm afraid. What we did get today was that the Department of Minerals and Energy published a request for information as part of a risk mitigation power procurement program. Essentially, that is putting out an official call to any party that can come forward with possible solutions to the energy crisis, and they're really looking at short-term solutions that can be put in place immediately. We did hear this week that the privately owned Minerals Council, that runs the mines, are keen and ready to produce their own power, but they're appealing to government to allow them to do so. So for many years, they could have generated their own power, enough power to continue mining outside of using Eskom, but they were never allowed to do so. So I think it's areas like this where there's an official tender almost to say, come forward with any solution that you may have that we can put in place right now in order to solve this crisis. Ramah?
Right, but with respect to Eskom itself, the bulk of the power it generates comes from coal power plants. A lot of those are old, they've been poorly maintained for years now. In order to reduce the cost of essentially getting Eskom back in black, is the government willing to give them an exemption to carbon taxes?
Well, this is a huge problem that was well known for many years before, this new carbon tax law was introduced. Eskom needs to cough up just under $1 billion to meet the carbon emissions tax, largely because of its use of coal. Now, Eskom, which produces more than 90% of South Africa's electricity, accounts for about 42% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. The new law kicked in June this year. There were exemptions for the first phase, but the second phase of the carbon tax will run from 2023 to 2030, and Eskom will have to come up with that money to pay over the tax. It already has a $40 billion debt. It's just not clear where it's going to get that money from to honor this tax, and we're not too sure at this stage as well where the government is willing to let that go. But as it stands, Treasury is now waiting for people to pay up on this tax. Ramah?
Indeed. One last question for you, Sumitra. We've covered this story in great detail for the last 5+ years on this program. And in 2014, Cyril Ramaphosa was then Deputy President, and he was appointed to oversee the turnaround, as it were, of South African Airways, Eskom, and of course SA Post as well. But does he acknowledge that he essentially failed in delivering on that turnaround?
This was really disappointing and concerning this week because the president went to see the Medupi power station for the very first time. The problem here is that it gives one the sense that the president is just really not in control of what's happening because he was very surprised. And the fact that he went there for the first time was really concerning, especially since he was, whilst still deputy president, put in charge of the war room, as you were saying, to tackle these big state-owned entities like SAA, the post office and Eskom. Now, people are wondering how come he didn't visit these power stations before, and he had years to handle these issues and still no resolve. So like yourself, everyone's wondering what happened in the last 5 years. What was the problem? Because the problems that we're experiencing now is just a situation where we're worse off than we were a few years ago, but the problems are still there. They just become bigger. So what was he doing in all of that time? What was also concerning this week is also the Public Enterprises Minister, Pravin Gordhan, said that this wasn't really a crisis. And later on, he says, yes, maybe it's a crisis, but it's a manageable crisis. So, South Africans are wondering whether they actually understand how big the situation is, how damaging it is to the economy, the cost that it is incurring, the losses that people are suffering, whether they're just not down on the ground and seeing the reality of the situation, because this has been there for so many years, and yet they still haven't figured out a possible solution.
Indeed, I guess we could call that the $50 billion disconnect country. Sumitra Naidu there live in Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, 45 million people across Africa right now are running short of food. Another 11 million in Southern Africa are at risk of starvation. For context, if you put those two numbers together, that's about 50 million people. That's essentially all of Kenya, if you will. UN agencies say some 16 countries in the Southern African region will be out of food in the next 6 months. Most countries have been hit by severe drought conditions, and that has affected the ability to produce food. Now, while parts of South Africa have recently had some very heavy rains, most of the farming areas in the country are still bone dry. CGTN's Sumitra Naidu filed this story.
It's the worst drought in over 35 years. While some parts of South Africa are getting good rains, farming areas in the north of the country and across the borders are suffering severe drought conditions.
Southern Africa, there's a massive drought at the moment. It's coming down from as high up as Zambia down through Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and then in South Africa as well. The western part of South Africa is extremely dry, and the northern part. There's quite a big impact on our exports. The agriculture exports is a big part of our income.
Climate change is causing erratic weather. Drought conditions are intensifying in Zambia, Angola, and in Zimbabwe. But in Mozambique, there's been flooding and cyclones. Both weather patterns are a disaster for any agricultural activity.
We have a disaster management center that is also have to come to the party in terms of regional or national droughts. We need capital to help farmers with livestock and obviously to retain jobs, look at tax breaks, that kind of thing. So it's very important for us to drive that agenda. At the same time, Agri-SA has our own fund where we help farmers in need and farming communities and farm workers across the country. We've lost about 30,000 jobs to date because of the drought.
The UN and other agencies are trying to get food aid to the region, but it might be too late for millions of people.
Food security is of concern. It's a big concern because South Africa services a lot of the regional countries in Africa with food. So we process a lot of food. We sell them in Zambia and Zimbabwe and Mozambique. So it's actually a regional problem.
Our best window of opportunity in this area is to start planting. We're already almost a month later than normal. But it's been the norm the last 3 years. So we start getting used to the shift of, we expect the shift of nature getting later and later every year. And it's impacting very badly on us as the farmers, because there's so many people depending on farming.
The impacts of climate change are being felt more and more each day. Farmers will have to adapt and educate themselves on surviving these extreme weather patterns. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to Zimbabwe now. Forests there are under threat from illegal charcoal traders who are burning down enormous amounts of indigenous mopani trees to supply a market for cooking fuel in cities that have been plunged into darkness by a severe power crisis. Here's CGTN's Farai Mokutoya with this report from Harare.
At first glance, it looks like a well-covered forest, but a closer inspection will show several stumps, evidence of its systematic stripping. There used to be many tall trees around, but they are all gone because of charcoal traders. Obed Madovi, a Mondorongezi villager, tells me.
The indigenous mopani tree is the main target for charcoal producers. They like it because of its strength. It's so tough, it would take several hours to try and chop it down using an axe, and so that's why they prefer to burn it to the ground.
From here, it's taken to markets in the cities where traders are cashing in on demand, driven by rolling power cuts of up to 18 hours a day.
People prefer charcoal because it's cheaper than other sources of energy, and since we are now in the rainy season, you can cook with it indoors unlike firewood.
For him, environmental impact is peripheral.
I am not sure where the charcoal comes from or how it is sourced, but I need to make a living, so that's why I sell it.
But his trade is fueling a time bomb.
You know, we have got a deforestation rate of approximately 330,000 hectares loss of forest cover in Zimbabwe annually. About 40% of that could be attributable to cutting down of trees for fueled energy.
Fines for trading charcoal and other forest products range from 60 Zimbabwe dollars to 700. Paltry amounts compared to the huge returns traders are making. And so authorities here are adopting a different approach.
The other way that we have dealt with that is actually taking people to court. And taking someone to court, they will be, if convicted, they are likely to spend up to 2 years in jail. And we think that route could also deter would-be criminals in this regard.
Hopefully, that will save some of the country's rapidly disappearing indigenous forest trees, some of which would need another lifetime to regenerate. Farangwa Kutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
There's a call for African economies and China to cooperate on available opportunities to provide clean and sustainable energy. That was one of the key issues that came out in the first conference on China-Africa Energy Cooperation in the Kenyan capital. CGTN's Wilkis Nyabwa was there.
And giving us support.
The conference brought together energy experts from think tanks, academia, government and organizations in the energy sector to deliberate on the economic potential of Africa's energy market. It was co-convened by the African Policy Institute and China National Petroleum Corporation, the world's third largest oil company based in China, alongside a slew of Chinese and African organizations. Energy cooperation has emerged as a major part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and as the need for energy grows, so Africa and China continue to find ways to partner for mutual benefit.
Belt and Road is from China, but belongs to the world. And who should play the critical role in this jointly building the BRI? I believe that is the private sector, not government.
Africa is a new frontier in the global energy market. It possesses 7.5% of global oil reserves and 7.1% of global gas reserves.
For African countries to develop even more in oil industry, it requires a lot of forms of technologies. China has the largest population. The consumption requirements are also huge. So you see, there's a lot that China and Africa can do together.
Those countries that were poor around 50, 60 years ago have transformed themselves into what they are because of energy.
Through cooperation and investment, partners hope to accelerate the growth of Africa's energy sector and develop it further.
We in the private sector are keen to partner, and in so doing, create wealth in this country, create jobs which are important because of the very huge number of youth that we have coming out of our institutions.
Energy investments in Belt and Road Initiative countries are expected to reach $27 trillion by 2050. The purpose of this assembly is to deepen international cooperation and build partnerships that will enhance Africa's economic development in the new global energy landscape. Wilkis Nyabwa, CGTN in Nairobi, Kenya.
Speaking of clean energy, Kenya's head of state has launched East and Central Africa's largest, so far, solar power plant. It's located in the northeastern town of Garissa. It's injecting about 50 megawatts, or rather it has a generation capacity of 50 megawatts, and all of that is being fed into the national grid. CGTN's Ramah Nyang was there.
The launch of the largest solar power plant in East and Central Africa. Located in Garissa County, about 350 kilometers from Nairobi, the plant has an installed capacity of 50 megawatts and took the contractor China Jiangxi Corporation just 15 months to complete. Kenya's president says the plant is part of his administration's push for cleaner energy in the power sector.
This is just the beginning. According to our plans, in a few years, we intend to have 400 megawatts powered by solar power.
The project, financed by Exim Bank of China at a cost of $124 million, will provide half of the energy needs for the town of Garissa.
It can be supplied to the about 70,000 households with 355,000 people. It's covered about 50% of the east and county of Garissa and powered to the national grid.
Built on about 80 hectares of land, the new plant is a boost to the East African country's push to become less reliant on diesel-powered plants and more on green energy. At least 50% of the country's power needs are generated from hydropower. In July this year, the country launched Africa's largest wind-powered farm in Turkana, generating about 310 megawatts of power. Wabat Nagila, CGTN, Garissa, Kenya.
Time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. A key committee approves 2 articles of impeachment against the US President Donald J. Trump. And we'll explore how Brazil is trying to strike a balance between conservation on one hand and development on the other.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Perina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed.
And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Ucheoko reporting from Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in. See, business
in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Ucheo Koronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back. Let's recap the stories making you headlines now. Boris Johnson, the UK's Prime Minister, has promised to deliver Brexit and repay the trust of voters after he led the Conservatives to a historic general election win. The Prime Minister has met the Queen to ask for permission to form a new government. That's after he secured a majority of 80 in the House of Commons. That's the party's largest single majority since 1987. In the meantime, in Algeria, the chairman of the country's National Independent Authority for Elections has announced that the former Prime Minister, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has won the country's presidential election. He secured 58.15% of votes cast. And finally, authorities in Niger have paid tribute to 71 soldiers who were killed by Islamist militants linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State earlier this week. The attack took place on a remote military camp in Niger near the border with Mali. The victims were laid to rest on Friday. That's a run through your headlines. Right, then development across the Atlantic now. A key committee of the Democrat-led U.S. House of Representatives has approved 2 articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. He is accused of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Now, the first article charges that Trump and his aides pressured the Ukraine to announce an investigation into the former Vice President Joe Biden. Trump also sought an investigation by Ukraine into a discredited theory that argues that promoted by Russia, that Ukraine and not Russia had interfered in the 2016 U.S. elections. As a result, Democrats alleged that Trump, through corrupt motives, injured U.S. national security to obtain what they described, and I quote here, an improper personal political benefit. Mr. Trump has denied any wrongdoing. He's repeatedly labeled the impeachment inquiry as a witch hunt or a sham. American pork producers are hoping for a trade deal with China as they want to meet the country's increased pork demand amid a struggle with African swine fever. With the details, here's CGTN's Dan Williams.
Brian Duncan's farm in Polo, in the US state of Illinois, has been in the family for 4 generations. He brings around 70,000 hogs to market annually. But over the last few years, much of his focus has been on events elsewhere. The trade war between the US and China has impacted farms across the US, denting exports and profits. He hopes the news of a trade deal will bring certainty to the industry and a major uptick in hog prices.
We have a lot of product. We typically export about 30% of what we produce, or 25 to 30% by quantity. But there's obviously potential for much greater numbers than that, and we'd hope that competition would be a lift in price.
And there is good reason for that optimism. Before the trade dispute, US pork sales to China accounted for around 20% of overall exports. That shrank by almost a third between April 2018 and April 2019, as China raised tariffs on pork from 12% to 62%.
The American economy and also the Chinese economy and the world economy are better off without this trade war than with the trade war. That's something that is undeniable.
Julian Diaz is an associate professor at Loyola University's Quinlan School of Business. With pork production in China and other parts of Asia decimated by African swine fever, Diaz sees huge potential for US pork farmers.
The US exports about $1 billion worth of pork products to China, and that's a market of $25 billion. So there is an enormous opportunity for pork exporters to fulfill that demand.
US pork farmers have taken some strain in recent years, weighed down by the various trade disputes. But the industry as a whole has fared better than other US agricultural sectors, thanks in part to the success of finding replacement markets.
The US increased pork exports to Colombia, South Korea and Vietnam in recent years, but those are dwarfed in size by the China market, where demand for whole pigs, including parts like feet and ears, adds even more value.
It's a very critical part of what we do and a very critical part of our profitability. Those exports have added value to portions of the animal that had no value before. It's very difficult to regain or replace that elsewhere where those products of the pig aren't as acceptable or desired.
It has been an uncertain time for US farming, but Duncan hopes trade relations between the US and China will now go from strained to strong. Dan Williams, CGTN, Arrowsmith, Illinois.
Let's get back to the business of energy and climate. Germany, of course, is a leading voice in the Paris Climate Accord. The government there is trying now to phase out coal power plants progressively as part of efforts to curb climate change and reduce the country's net greenhouse gas emissions. With this report, here's CGTN's Guy Henderson.
The illegal occupants of the ancient Hambach forest believe the victory they have fought for may be close.
Okay, so we're climbing up. Yeah, 13 meters.
A big German coal company has long wanted to remove them from their makeshift homes and clear this place to mine it. However, reaching them has not been easy. Residents here, including our climbing companion, who goes by the name of Tempest, hopes the government will soon close a nearby coal pit.
I mean, the forest thing would be a big tree, and I think it's about to happen.
Since government plans to phase out this most dirty of fossil fuels was announced earlier this year, the worry is no longer if, but it is still when.
Only 1/4 of the lignite production is going to be stopped in the first 3 years of the coal exit. I mean, if they do a final push in this forest, the forest is gone. Like they cannot dig the coal here and not cut down the forest. So if this mine is not closed in the first 3 years of the coal exit, this forest has to be gone.
Mostly it's already gone, replaced by this. One tiny slither remains. Despite repeated court orders and attempted police evictions. Now the establishment appears more aligned with what has grown into a symbol of the climate rebellion in Germany and beyond.
Germany's become a leading voice in calls for saving the Paris Climate Accords, and yet nearly 40% of its electricity comes from coal plants like these. That's a major stain on its green credentials. So now the government has come up with a proposal to phase it out as a source of energy by 2038.
But this is not without consequences. Coal bosses say up to 20,000 jobs could be at stake and that consumers could suffer from higher utility bills. Because all of Germany's nuclear plants will also be decommissioned by 2022. It has an advanced alternative energy programme. Still, say analysts, coal's phase-out brings tough choices.
There has been and will be an increasing investment into energy sources like wind and water. But of course, Germany will also get its energy from outside of Germany, and the provisions of gas via Russia are a key element in at least the medium-term strategy for Germany.
Those living in the Hambach forest don't agree with their government on much. They are increasingly aligned on this, though. The costs of ending Germany's 200-year addiction to coal are more than worth it. Guy Henderson, CGTN, in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia.
Now, balancing conservation and development is one of the big challenges that Brazil faces, especially when it comes to the Amazon. Tourism in the rainforest is a good example of an activity that, when well managed, can do both of those things at the same time. CGTN's Paulo Cabral takes us to a region of river beaches in the Brazilian state of Pará, where tourism is taking root.
Geralda dos Santos sells popsicles and snacks on this river beach in the heart of the Amazon jungle. She was concerned about the wildfires that hit this region a few months ago. While she cares about the long-term health of the planet, she also worries about her immediate livelihood.
We have to be careful with all these things that God made for us. This is the wonder of God that He has left for us so we can make our living here. If the environment is destroyed, tourists will not come here anymore. We need these trees standing here.
The district of Alter do Chão, in the Amazon city of Santarém, is situated on the banks of the Tapajós River. Over the years, it has been attracting a growing number of tourists who come here to enjoy the white sand beaches that appear when the warm waters of the Tapajós recede during the dry season.
Money needs to be invested to help the local population and develop tourist activity. We all have to understand that this has to be preserved so people will keep coming and get to know our culture.
The Ilha do Amor, the Island of Love, is the postcard image of Alter do Chão. It appears in late July, early August, marking the beginning of a tourist season that runs until around February or March, when this will all be covered again by the waters of the Tapajós River. The mayor of Santarém says tourism offers a profitable and sustainable alternative to other activities of higher environmental impact.
We want development for Santar, but sustainable development. We cannot make the same mistakes of the past when we had economic activities here that were harmful to the environment, like logging and even cattle farming, that caused a lot of deforestation.
The sunset at Ponta do Cururu is one of the highlights of a visit to this beach district in the middle of the Amazon jungle. Hopes here are that this area will be preserved so people can enjoy the scenery and bring revenue to the region for many years to come. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Alter do Chão, Brazil.
Right, then a quick run through commodity prices for you. Brent has been rising steadily, really, since late September, last week of September, actually. And it's risen back to levels that we last saw around Q3 and somewhere in the middle of the year, too. At today's levels, Brent is up 17.5%. Even the crude benchmark on the other side of the Atlantic, WTI, that had a pretty solid day. It's actually risen to a 3-month high, above $60 a barrel. In part, that's a relief rally on news that there's some progress in getting a Phase 1 trade deal between the United States and China. You can expect more coverage on that in subsequent bulletins. Here's what's coming up next. After the break, we'll introduce you to an Ethiopian firm that's converting weeds into renewable energy.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Let's head on to Ethiopia now, where a cooperative organization is converting weeds into renewable energy. It's a classic lemons lemonade story, this. The program seeks to provide a livelihood for refugees and host communities too. CGTN's Terry Wangari has the details on Grassroots tonight.
Wapido Cooperative is located in Ethiopia's arid south.
The cooperative is supported by the IKEA Foundation. Its main venture is providing renewable energy using prosopis trees.
Where this tree grows, it eradicates all other trees. It grows alone. That is the biggest problem. The root grows deep down into the ground and stretches wide, and it is hard for other trees to grow.
Prosopis trees were first planted here 50 years ago. Its spread in the area has been the source of major conflicts.
We have seen that there is a problem with the refugee and the local host community. Mostly the conflict come on, when they go to the bush and find firewood.
By converting the weed into charcoal, the program not only promotes peace but also boosts the local economy.
They become, client and producer. The host community, they cut the firewood, the prosopis, and they sold it to the refugee cooperative. And the refugee cooperative, they take the prosopis and then they process in this center.
Prosopis trees are designated as weeds due to their invasive nature. It's widely believed charcoal made from it burns longer than the regular ones. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
And a quick run through the currencies for you. So whichever way you slice it, sterling has had a pretty good day. It's gone as high as 135 to the dollar in the wake of the results of that snap December 12 election. That's the best really it's been all year, according to Bloomberg data. It's also up 4.7% against the dollar so far in the year. Ghana's currency continues its horrible run this year, falling by over 16% so far against the year. At today's levels, 572.75 is relatively low, but it's not far off the record low 5.9 that we have on Bloomberg's record. So that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour or so. There are many ways to get your feedback to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last 60 minutes. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.